Some folks say the hardest thing about getting old is watching everyone you love leave this world before you do. For 73-year-old Hank Tolliver, alone in his mountain cave with winter closing in, that loneliness has become his final companion. 30 years of trapping in the Sierra Nevada have worn him down to bone and gristle. His hands shake, his heart skips beats, and he's made peace with dying alone when the snow melts. Then one bitter night, a starving grizzly stumbles into his firelight. Instead of attacking, the massive bear sits down and raises its paw like it's asking for help. Hank tosses the creature his last piece of jerky. What happens over the next few weeks changes everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the strange ways the wilderness speaks to a man's soul. But is this really just a hungry bear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cave carved into the granite face of Eagle's Peak had become Hank Tolliver's cathedral, his confessional, and what he'd long accepted would be his tomb. He'd hollowed it out himself over 3 decades, one chisel strike at a time during the long winter months when the snow piled 15 feet deep, and the only sound for miles was the whisper of wind through pine needles. The entrance faced southeast, catching the first pale light of dawn and holding on to the last golden rays before the sun disappeared behind the western ridges. Inside, the space stretched back 20 feet into the mountain's belly, wide enough for a man to live, but narrow enough to heat with a single fire. Stone shelves held his meager possessions: tins of beans and coffee, a battered metal cup, 3 books read so many times their spines had cracked and healed like old bones. On the highest shelf, wrapped in oiled leather, lay a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. Sarah. Even now, 8 years after the cancer took her, Hank's chest tightened when he looked at that picture. She'd been gone longer than they'd had together, but time had a different meaning up here in the thin air. Some days felt like decades, others passed like heartbeats. The mountain had taught him that grief, like weather, moved in patterns, sometimes gentle as morning mist, sometimes violent as a summer thunderstorm. He'd met Sarah in the valley town of Cedar Falls during his last supply run of 1,962. She'd been working behind the counter at Morrison's General Store, tallying inventory with the focused attention of someone who took pride in small details. When Hank approached with his list: salt, flour, ammunition, lamp oil, she'd looked up with eyes the color of sage and asked if he lived up in the high country. Most of the year, he'd answered, suddenly conscious of his rough appearance and the scent of wood smoke that clung to his clothes. Must get lonely, she'd said, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity. Sometimes, the honesty surprised him. He hadn't meant to say it. She'd smiled then, an expression that warmed him more than any campfire. Well, if you ever need company, for conversation, I work here most days except Sundays. That conversation stretched into weekly visits whenever he came down for supplies. Sarah would save him coffee in a thermos, and they'd sit on the store's front porch, talking about books, weather, the way the light changed with the seasons. She'd grown up in the valley, but dreamed of seeing the high peaks. He'd grown up in Chicago, but found peace only in the wilderness. They were opposites who fit together like 2 pieces of a puzzle. Neither had known was incomplete. They married in the spring of 1964, Sarah wearing her mother's simple dress and Hank in the only suit he owned. The ceremony took place in the small church at the center of town, with half the population of Cedar Falls in attendance. For their honeymoon, he brought her up to the cave, then just a shallow depression he'd been slowly enlarging with hand tools. "This is where I want to build our life," he told her, standing at the cave mouth with the entire Sierra range spread out before them like a rumpled blanket. Sarah had taken his weathered hand in her soft one. "Then we better get to work." They'd spent 5 years carving out their sanctuary, Sarah proved stronger than her delicate appearance suggested, hauling stones for the fire ring, helping him shape the interior walls, planting a small garden in the sheltered spot just below the cave where snowmelt collected in a natural basin. She'd brought civilization to his wilderness, not the harsh, crowded kind he'd fled from Chicago, but the gentle civilization of shared meals. Quiet evenings reading by firelight, morning coffee watched over by hawks riding the thermal currents. The books on his shelf had been hers. Walden, a Sand County almanac, and a leather-bound volume of Frost's poetry. She'd read to him in the evenings, her voice giving life to words about nature and solitude that somehow sounded different coming from someone who'd chosen this life rather than fled to it. They tried for children. Lord, how they tried. But the mountains seemed to demand a different kind of legacy from them. Sarah never spoke bitterly about it, though sometimes Hank caught her watching the hawk families that nested in the cliff faces, her expression wistful and far away. "Maybe we're meant to tend to something else," she'd said once, watching him nurse an injured fox kit back to health. "Maybe our children are the ones with fur and feathers." The fox had recovered and returned to the wild, but others followed injured. Owls, a bear cub separated from its mother. Countless small creatures that seemed to understand Sarah possessed some healing grace. She'd built a reputation among the animals, and Hank had marveled at how creatures that would flee from his approach would come willingly to her gentle hands. The first signs of her illness appeared in the autumn of 1975. A persistent cough she blamed on the early cold snap. Fatigue that made their daily chores more difficult. When she began losing weight, despite eating well, Hank convinced her to see the doctor in town. Dr. Patterson had been gentle but direct. Lung cancer, advanced. 6 months, maybe 8 with treatment. Sarah had asked if she could have some time to think, and they'd driven back up the mountain road in silence, both knowing what her answer would be. "I want to die at home," she'd said that night, sitting by their fire with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. "I want to see one more winter up here. I want to watch the hawks return in spring." She'd lived to see the hawks, but just barely. The cancer took her on a morning in April, when the snow was finally retreating and the first wildflowers pushed through the dark soil. Hank had held her hand as her breathing grew shallow, promising her he'd be all right, though they both knew it was a lie. He'd buried her in the small clearing where she tended her garden, marking the grave with a simple stone cairn. For weeks afterward, he'd expected her to walk through the cave entrance, to ask why he'd let the fire burn so low or whether he'd remembered to check the snares. The silence had nearly driven him mad. That first year alone, he'd considered leaving. The mountain, the cave felt too empty, too full of echoes. But Sarah's books remained on their shelf. Her coffee cup sat beside his own. And somehow the idea of abandoning their sanctuary felt like abandoning her memory. So he'd stayed. The years had carved lines in his face deeper than any chisel had cut into stone. His hair had gone white. His hands had developed a permanent shake of arthritis. And his heart had begun skipping beats like a needle jumping on an old record. He'd made peace with dying up here. Had even come to see a certain rightness in it. He and Sarah would rest on the same mountain, under the same stars they'd watched together for all those years. Around his neck, hidden beneath his wool shirt, hung Sarah's wedding ring on a simple chain. He'd tried once to bury it with her, but at the last moment couldn't bring himself to let go. The gold band had worn smooth from decades of her wearing it, and now it warmed against his chest like a small sun, a reminder that some kinds of love survive even death. The photograph on the shelf showed Sarah at 42, just 2 years before the cancer. She'd been helping him repair the cave's entrance after a rock slide, her hair tied back with a strip of leather, her face flushed with exertion and accomplishment. Hank had surprised her with his old camera, catching her in a moment of pure joy. In the picture, she was laughing at something he'd said, one hand raised to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was how he wanted to remember her, not the frail woman who'd faded away in his arms, but the strong partner who'd helped him build this life stone by stone. Every morning for 8 years, Hank had woken to the sight of that photograph. Every evening, he'd wished it good night. On the hardest days, when his chest pain was sharp and his breathing labored, he'd wondered if this would be the night he joined her. Part of him hoped so. The cave had everything he needed to see another winter through, assuming his heart kept beating. Dried meat hung from the ceiling beams, protected by cheesecloth from mice. Root vegetables filled a cool storage pit he dug into the cave floor. Firewood, cut and split during the warmer months, stood stacked against the back wall, in neat rows. His traps, cleaned and oiled, waited for the day he might feel strong enough to set them again. But strength seemed to be leaving him like water seeping through cracked stone. Simple tasks that had once been routine now left him breathless. Some mornings, he barely managed to kindle the fire before exhaustion forced him back to his bedroll. The mountain that had been his refuge was becoming his hospice, and he'd accepted that with the same quiet resignation he'd learned to apply to all of life's inevitable changes. That acceptance had made the Grizzly's arrival all the more startling. In 30 years of mountain living, Hank had learned to read the signs of every season, to anticipate the behavior of every creature that shared this high country. Bears denned up by November and didn't emerge until March or April. They certainly didn't appear on bitter winter nights, starved and desperate. And they absolutely didn't sit politely by a man's fire like dogs begging for scraps. Yet there it had happened, and here he sat the next morning, staring at the bear tracks in the snow outside his cave and wondering if loneliness had finally cracked his mind. The tracks were real enough, massive paw prints pressed deep into the drifted snow, leading from the pine forest to his fire ring and back again. If he dreamed the encounter, it was the most vivid dream of his life. The memory played over in his mind like scenes from Sarah's favorite movie. Watched so many times, every detail stood out in sharp relief. The bear's eyes reflecting firelight, intelligent and patient. The careful way it had raised its paw, more gesture than threat. The almost human sigh of satisfaction when it swallowed the jerky he'd thrown. Most unsettling of all was the way the creature had looked at him, not with the calculated assessment of a predator evaluating prey, but with something that looked almost like recognition, as if they'd met before somewhere. In some context his conscious mind couldn't quite recall. Hank reached for his morning coffee, noting how his hand trembled as he lifted the cup. Sarah's ring swung gently against his chest with the movement, a familiar weight that had become part of him. He'd told that bear about Sarah. He remembered now. Spoken aloud about her for the first time since her death. Words spilling out into the winter darkness as if the animal's presence had unlocked something he'd kept sealed away. Crazy old fool, he murmured to himself, but without much conviction. Sarah had always insisted that the line between the possible and impossible was thinner than most people believed. She'd claimed to feel the presence of her grandmother's spirit in the cave sometimes, usually when she was tending to injured animals. Hank had never felt anything like that himself, but he'd learned to trust Sarah's instincts about things beyond the reach of logic. Outside, the wind carried the sharp scent of more snow coming. The sky had that peculiar gray-white quality that meant a storm was building in the western peaks. Hank would need to bring in more firewood before the weather turned, assuming his strength held out. He'd managed to maintain most of his routines despite his failing health, but each task took longer now, required more rest between efforts. As he prepared to venture outside, Hank found himself hoping the bear might return. The thought surprised him. 30 years ago, he would have set traps or taken his rifle to deal with a grizzly that had lost its fear of humans. Now, approaching his own final winter, he discovered he craved the companionship more than he feared the danger. Maybe then, bear had been as lonely as he was. Maybe, in the strange mathematics of wilderness survival, they needed each other more than they posed a threat to one another. It wasn't a thought he would have entertained in his younger days, but age had a way of changing a man's perspective on risk and reward. Sarah's ring bumped against his ribs as he pulled on his heavy coat. He could almost hear her voice in the cave's familiar echoes, gentle but insistent. Some gifts come disguised as problems, Hank. Don't be too quick to turn them away. The Grizzly returned the second night like a dinner guest who'd forgotten to mention he was coming. Hank had spent the day splitting kindling, a task that had taken him 3 times longer than it should have. His chest ached with each swing of the hatchet, and twice he'd had to stop and lean against the cave wall until his heart found its rhythm again. By evening, he was exhausted enough that he'd barely managed to heat a can of beans before collapsing onto his bedroll. He dozed fitfully beside the fire, Sarah's photograph catching the flickering light from the shelf above. In his half-sleep, he'd almost convinced himself the previous night's encounter had been a dream brought on by loneliness and thin air. Bears didn't behave that way. They certainly didn't return to the same spot like pets expecting dinner. The soft padding of massive paws on snow brought him fully awake. There it sat, just beyond the fire's circle of light, as patient as a congregation waiting for Sunday service to begin. The Grizzly's enormous bulk made the cave entrance seem suddenly small, but the creature showed no inclination to come closer. It simply waited, breath steaming in the cold air, eyes reflecting the flames with that same unsettling intelligence. "You're back," Hank said, his voice hoarse from sleep. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, swiveling forward with obvious attention. "I was starting to think I'd imagined you." As if responding to some invisible cue, the Grizzly shifted its weight and gently placed something at the edge of the firelight. Then it retreated a respectful distance, settling back on its haunches with the satisfied air of someone who completed an important task. Hank squinted through the wavering flames, trying to make out what the creature had brought. When he finally recognized the shape, his breath caught in his throat. A trout, fresh and fat, its scales still gleaming with moisture. A rainbow trout that had to weigh 3 pounds, the kind of fish he hadn't seen in these high streams for years. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. The bear made a low rumbling sound that might have been agreement. Hank struggled to his feet, joints protesting after hours on the hard ground. He approached the fish slowly, aware that the Grizzly watched his every movement. The trout was indeed fresh, so fresh that water still beaded on its fins. But the streams had been frozen solid for weeks. Where had this creature found running water in the dead of winter? "Where'd you get this, friend?" Hank asked, crouching to examine the fish. "And more important, why bring it to me?" The bear tilted its massive head, a gesture so human-like that Hank felt the familiar prickle of unease along his spine. In 30 years of wilderness living, he'd developed instincts about animal behavior that had kept him alive through encounters with everything, from mountain lions to winter storms. Those instincts were screaming that nothing about this situation made sense. But Sarah's ring was warm against his chest, and her voice seemed to whisper in the back of his mind. "Some gifts come disguised as problems, Hank." "All right," he said. "Finally, I accept. But if you're bringing dinner, you're staying to share it." The bear's response was to move closer to the fire, settling down with its back legs tucked under its body like a dog. The flames painted moving shadows across its dark fur, and Hank was struck by how the creature managed to seem both wild and oddly domesticated. Its size was impressive, 7 feet at the shoulder, probably pushing 800 pounds, but its demeanor remained calm, almost gentle-dawed, as Hank prepared the fish. He found himself talking to his unusual companion. The words came easier than they had the night before, as if the barrier between thought and speech had thinned. "Sarah would have loved this," he said. scaling the trout with his old fillet knife. She always said the mountain provided what we needed when we needed it. I used to think that was just her romantic way of looking at coincidence, but maybe she knew something I didn't. The bear made that rumbling sound again, deeper this time, almost conversational. She was like you in a way, Hank continued, cutting the fish into portions. Drew creatures to her like she had some kind of magic. Birds would land on her shoulders. Deer would eat from her hand. I always figured it was because she moved quiet and never meant any harm. He set a portion of the raw fish on a flat stone and slid it toward the grizzly, who accepted it with dignified appreciation. The cooked portion he kept for himself, savoring the first fresh fish he tasted in months. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them like a translator neither needed, but both appreciated Dodd as the night deepened. Hank noticed details about his guest that struck him as increasingly unusual. The bear's left ear had a small notch cut into it, too clean to be from a fight with another animal. Around its thick neck, barely visible through the dense fur, was what looked like a thin line of different coloration, as if something had once been worn there. You've been around people before, haven't you? Hank asked quietly. That notch in your ear, that mark around your neck. Someone put their hands on you when you were smaller. The grizzly's eyes met his across the fire, and for a moment Hank felt as if he was looking at something far older and more complex than simple animal intelligence. There was recognition there, and something that looked like gratitude, but underneath lay a sadness so profound it made his chest tight. What happened to them? He whispered. The people who marked you? The bear's only answer was to move closer, until it lay just at the edge of the fire's warmth. Close enough that Hank could have reached out and touched the coarse fur, though he didn't dare. Instead, he added another log to the flames and settled back against his bedroll. I lost someone too, he said into the darkness. Sarah, 8 years ago this spring. Cancer took her, slow and mean. I buried her up in the clearing where she used to tend her garden. Sometimes I still catch myself saving things to tell her, forgetting for a minute that she's not coming back. The grizzly made a sound that was almost a whimper, low and mournful. Its massive head drooped until its chin nearly touched the ground, and Hank felt a shock of recognition. He'd seen that exact posture in his own reflection, the weight of grief made visible. You understand, don't you? He asked. You know what it means to lose someone you can't live without. As if in response, the bear lifted its enormous paw and placed it gently on the stone beside Hank's hand. Not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from the dark pads. The gesture was so deliberate, so unmistakably communicative that Hank's breath caught in his throat. He reached out slowly, covering the bear's paw with his weathered hand. The fur was coarser than he'd expected, but warm and somehow comforting. The grizzly made no move to withdraw, simply allowed the contact like an old friend offering wordless support. They stayed that way for what felt like hours, man and beast, sharing the weight of loss across the space between species. Eventually, the fire burned low and Hank's eyes grew heavy. When he next opened them, dawn was painting the eastern peaks pink, and the bear was gone. But the memory of that gentle touch remained, along with something Hank hadn't felt in 8 years, the sense that he wasn't entirely alone in the world. Outside the cave, fresh tracks in the snow led away toward the deeper forest, but they were different from the night before. These prints showed claw marks that looked almost like letters scratched into the frozen ground. Hank knelt beside them, tracing the shapes. With his finger, wondering if his aging eyes were playing tricks on him, the marks looked like they spelled something. A single word, written in a language of claw and snow that his rational mind rejected, but his heart somehow understood. Help. Hank sat back on his heels, staring at the impossible message. A bear couldn't write, couldn't form human words, couldn't even understand the concept of written communication. Yet there it was, clear as his own handwriting, scratched into the snow with deliberate precision. "What kind of help?" he whispered to the empty forest. "What do you need from an old man who can barely help himself?" The wind through the pines carried no answer, but as Hank rose stiffly to his feet, he noticed something glinting in the snow near the strange tracks. He bent and picked up a small object that made his hands tremble, not from the cold or his condition, but from the impossibility of what he held: a collar. Old leather, cracked and weathered, with a simple metal buckle green with age. The kind of collar a person might put on a dog or, in years past, on a tame bear kept as a pet or circus animal. Hidden beneath the bear's thick winter fur, this collar would have been invisible unless someone knew to look for it. But now it lay in his palm like evidence of a mystery he was only beginning to understand. Somewhere in the forest, his impossible visitor was watching, waiting to see what the old mountain man would make of this revelation. And for the first time in 8 years, Hank Tolliver had a reason to stay, alive long enough to find out. The collar changed everything and nothing at the same time. For 3 days after finding it, Hank carried the weathered leather in his coat pocket, taking it out periodically to study the worn buckle and faded stitching. The metal showed signs of having been polished once, carefully maintained by hands that valued what it represented. But time and mountain weather had reduced it to a simple artifact of some forgotten bond between human and animal. The bear continued its nightly visits with the reliability of a scheduled train. Each evening, as shadows lengthened across the snow and the first stars appeared over the eastern peaks, the massive grizzly would emerge from the tree line and settle beside Hank's fire. Sometimes it brought gifts, another fish, a handful of late berries preserved by the cold, once a piece of honeycomb that must have taken considerable effort to retrieve from a winter-dormant hive. On the 4th night, Hank decided to test a theory that had been growing in his mind like a seed in fertile ground. "I've got something that belongs to you," he said as the bear took its usual position by the flames. The creature's ears pricked forward with obvious interest. Its dark eyes followed Hank's movements as he reached into his pocket and withdrew the collar. The moment the leather appeared, the grizzly went absolutely still, not with threat, but with the focused attention of someone seeing a treasured photograph after years of separation. "This is yours, isn't it?" Hank held the collar up where the firelight caught the metal buckle. "You wore this when you were smaller, when someone cared enough to put it on you and keep it clean." The bear made a soft sound, almost a whimper, and lowered its massive head. The gesture was so clearly an invitation that Hank found himself moving forward despite every survival instinct screaming warnings. He approached slowly, the collar stretched between his hands until he knelt beside. The grizzly's enormous bulk dot up close. The animal's size was overwhelming. Its shoulders stood higher than Hank's waist, and each breath moved enough air to disturb the fire's flames. But the bear remained perfectly still as Hank's weathered fingers found the thin line around its neck where the collar had once rested. The fur there was lighter, permanently pressed flat by years of wearing the leather band. "Easy now," Hank murmured, working to fasten the collar around the thick neck. The leather had stretched with age, but it still fit snug enough to stay in place, but loose enough to allow comfort. When the buckle clicked shut, the bear lifted its head and looked directly into Hank's eyes. What he saw there nearly stopped his heart. Intelligence, certainly, but more than that, recognition, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like relief. As if wearing the collar again had restored some essential part of its identity that had been missing. "Who put this on you?" "The first time?" Hank asked softly. "Who loved you enough to treat you like family?" The bear's only answer was to move closer until its warm bulk pressed gently against Hank's side. The contact should have terrified him. 800 pounds. Of predator with claws longer than his fingers and jaws capable of crushing bone. Instead, he felt safer than he had in years, as if he'd found a guardian rather than befriended a threat. They sat together in comfortable silence, sharing the fire's warmth and the vast quiet of the mountain night. Eventually, Hank's old bones demanded the softness of his bedroll, and he reluctantly pulled away from the bear's reassuring presence. "I suppose you'll be gone come morning," he said, settling onto his sleeping furs. "That seems to be your pattern." But when dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the snowfields gold and rose, the grizzly remained. It had moved away from the dying fire during the night, but only to the mouth of the cave, where it lay like a massive guardian, watching the forest for threats that would never dare approach with such a protector in place. Hank's morning routine took on a different rhythm with company to consider. He heated extra coffee, though the bear showed no interest in the bitter brew. He shared his breakfast of oatmeal and dried fruit, finding the creature had a particular fondness for the apple pieces Sarah had dried and stored in mason jars. "I've loved watching you eat those," Hank commented as the bear delicately picked apple slices from his palm with surprising gentleness. "Always said food tastes better when it's shared with someone who appreciates it." The bear's rumbling response sounded almost like agreement. As the day progressed, Hank found himself falling into one-sided conversations with his companion. He talked while splitting kindling, the bear watching with patient attention, as if every word carried significance. He narrated his daily tasks, checking the weather, organizing supplies, maintaining his equipment, and discovered that speaking his thoughts aloud helped clarify them in ways solitary contemplation never had. "You know what strikes me as strange?" he said while mending a torn shirt by firelight. "In 30 years up here, I've never seen a bear act the way you do. Never seen one that seemed to understand human speech, or one that brought gifts instead of taking what it wanted by force." The grizzly tilted its head, a gesture that had become familiar over their few days together. "Sarah used to read to me from her nature books," Hank continued, working the needle through the thick fabric. "Stories about animals that formed unusual bonds with people. I always figured those were just tales, the kind of stories folks tell to make the wild seem less wild. But maybe I was wrong about that." He set down his mending and reached for one of Sarah's books, the leather-bound volume of Thoreau that she'd loved best. The pages fell open to a passage she'd marked with a pressed wildflower, now brown with age but still holding the ghost of summer color. "Listen to this," Hank said, holding the book closer to the firelight. "It says here, 'Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads.'" Sarah loved that line. Said it meant the sacred wasn't something far away, but right here around us if we just knew how to see it. The bear made that rumbling sound again, and Hank found himself wondering if the creature understood more than just the tone of his voice. There was something about its attention, the way it seemed to hang on certain words, that suggested a deeper comprehension than simple animal intelligence should allow. "She marked a lot of passages in these books," Hank continued, turning pages carefully. "Look here. The only way to speak truly is to speak as if you were dying. I never understood what that meant until after she was gone. Then it seemed like the most obvious thing in the world." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave's stone ceiling. Outside, the wind carried the promise of more snow, but inside the cave felt warmer than it had in years. Not just from the flames, but from the simple presence of another living being who seemed to find comfort in his company. "I spent 8 years getting ready to die," Hank said quietly. "Made my peace with it, accepted it as the natural end of things. But sitting here with you, I'm starting to wonder if maybe I was being premature about that acceptance." The grizzly shifted position, moving close enough that Hank could feel the warmth radiating from its massive frame. Its eyes reflected the firelight as it gazed at him with that unsettling intelligence, and Hank had the distinct impression that his words were being weighed and considered rather than simply heard. Question is, he murmured, closing Sarah's book and setting it carefully aside. What exactly are you trying to tell me? And why do I get the feeling that my answer matters more than I understand? The bear's only response was to settle more comfortably beside the fire, but its eyes remained fixed on Hank's face with an intensity that suggested their conversation was far from over. The discovery came by accident, the way most important things do in life. Hank had been searching through his storage boxes for a spare wool sock when his fingers found the cloth-wrapped bundle he'd forgotten was there. Sarah's sketchbook, tucked away behind bags of dried beans and tins of coffee like a secret he'd kept even from himself. For 8 years, he'd avoided looking through her drawings, afraid that seeing her artistic vision of their mountain world would break something inside him that had finally begun to heal. But with the Grizzly watching from its position by the fire, patient as a congregation waiting for Sunday service, Hank found himself unwrapping the leather portfolio with hands that barely trembled. The bear seemed to sense the significance of the moment, its intelligent eyes tracking every movement as Hank opened the cover to reveal Sarah's delicate pencil work. The first few pages showed familiar subjects: the view from their cave entrance, the small garden where she'd grown vegetables, detailed studies of pine cones and wildflowers. Sarah had possessed the kind of artistic eye that found beauty in ordinary things, and her sketches captured the mountain's quiet majesty with a few carefully placed lines. She drew everything, Hank murmured, turning pages slowly. Said it helped? Or see better, paying attention to details most folks miss. The bear made that rumbling sound that had become familiar, shifting closer as if drawn by the pictures. Hank held the sketchbook at an angle where his companion could see the drawings, and was startled by the creature's obvious interest. Its eyes studied each image with the focused attention of someone examining photographs of a beloved place. Halfway through the book, Hank found the sketch that stopped his heart. The drawing showed a grizzly bear sitting beside a mountain stream, one paw raised as if waving or asking for something. But this wasn't just any bear. The proportions, the distinctive marking around one ear, the intelligent expression captured in a few masterful strokes, all matched his current companion perfectly. At the bottom of the page, in Sarah's careful handwriting, were the words, "The one who asks instead of takes." June 1974. Jesus, Hank breathed, looking from the sketch to the actual bear sitting not 5 feet away. She drew you. 30 years ago, she drew you. The grizzly's response was immediate and unmistakable. It moved closer, pressing its massive head against Hank's shoulder and making a sound that was part whimper, part sigh. The gesture was so clearly one of recognition and grief that Hank felt tears burning his eyes for the first time since Sarah's funeral. "You knew her," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You were here when she was alive. She met you, didn't she? Drew you because you were special, because you were different from other bears." The creature's only answer was to remain pressed against his side, radiating warmth and something that felt remarkably like shared sorrow. Hank turned the page with shaking fingers and found another sketch, this one showing the same bear bringing fish to a small figure seated by a cave entrance. Sarah had drawn herself receiving the gift with obvious delight, and beneath the image she'd written, "Even the wild things understand kindness." "She never told me," Hank said, though even as he spoke the words, he understood why. Sarah had possessed a gift for connecting with wounded creatures, and she'd known him well enough to predict his reaction to learning she'd been feeding a grizzly. He would have worried, would have insisted on precautions that might have driven the bear away. So she'd kept the encounters to herself, treasuring them as her own secret communion with the wilderness. The bear pulled back slightly, meeting Hank's eyes with an expression that seemed to hold decades of patient waiting. Suddenly, the creature's behavior over the past weeks made perfect sense. It hadn't been drawn to Hank by hunger or chance. It had been drawn by memory, by grief that matched his own, by the recognition of someone who had loved the same woman. "You've been alone too," Hank said softly. "All these years you've been carrying the same emptiness I have. That's why you came back. That's why you brought gifts. You were trying to honor her memory the only way you knew how." The Grizzly made a sound that was unmistakably agreement, and Hank felt something shift inside his chest, not the painful arrhythmia that had been troubling him, but something deeper. The walls he built around his heart to contain his grief were developing cracks, and through those fissures came a warmth he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. He continued turning pages, finding more sketches of his companion in various poses and seasons. Sarah had been documenting their relationship over what must have been months or even years. The bear sleeping in dappled sunlight, playing in a mountain stream, bringing her flowers evidence of a bond that had been kept secret from everyone, including the man who shared her life. "She wrote about you too," Hank realized, remembering passages from Sarah's journal that he'd read after her death. References to a gentle giant and a forest friend that he'd assumed were her poetic ways of describing the wilderness in general. "I thought she was just being fanciful, but she was writing about you specifically." Near the end of the sketchbook, he found a drawing that made his breath catch. It showed Sarah sitting in their cave, clearly ill, her face gaunt, her body fragile, but smiling as she offered something to the bear. The creature sat at the cave entrance, respectful of the boundary between wild and domestic, but clearly reluctant to leave. Below the sketch, Sarah had written, "My last visitor. He knows what I know." "You were here when she was dying," Hank whispered. "You came to say goodbye." The bear's confirmation was a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than its throat. It was the sound of a creature that understood loss, that had carried its own grief through 8 lonely years, just as Hank had carried his. "Why didn't I see you then?" Hank asked. "Why wait until now to show yourself to me?" The answer, when it came to him, was so obvious he wondered how he'd missed it. The bear had been respecting his need to grieve alone, just as he might have respected its need for solitude. But now, with both of them facing the approaching end of their lives, Hank's heart growing weaker, the bear showing signs of age in its slower movements and graying muzzle, they had found each other at exactly the moment when solitude had become too heavy a burden to bear alone. "We're both old now," Hank said, reaching out to touch the coarse fur of the bear's massive head, "both carrying more memories than our hearts can hold. Maybe that's why you came back. Maybe grief shared is grief. Halved, like Sarah always said about happiness." The Grizzly leaned into his touch, and for the first time in 8 years, Hank Tolliver didn't feel like the last man on earth. Sarah's ring warmed against his chest, but instead of the cold comfort of memory, it now felt like a bridge connecting him to something larger than his own sorrow, a web of love and loss that included not just humans, but all the creatures who understood what it meant to care for someone beyond themselves. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cave, warmed by fire and unexpected companionship, the winter felt less like an ending and more like a pause before something new could begin. 3 weeks into their unlikely companionship, the bear brought Hank a gift that changed everything he thought he understood about their relationship. It was a child's toy, a small wooden horse, carved with the patient detail of someone who'd had time and love to invest in getting the proportions exactly right. The paint had mostly worn away, leaving only traces of blue in the deepest grooves of the mane, but the craftsmanship remained evident. Someone had sanded every surface smooth, had taken care to round the edges so no small hand could be hurt during play. The bear had placed it gently beside Hank's morning coffee, then retreated to its usual position by the fire ring, but its eyes remained fixed on Hank's face with an intensity that suggested this particular gift carried more weight than the fish and berries that had preceded it. "Where did you find this, friend?" Hank asked, turning the toy horse over in his. weathered hands. The wood was dry but not rotted, suggesting it hadn't been exposed to the elements for too long. This was someone's treasure, a child's favorite by the look of how well it's been handled. The bear made that rumbling sound that had become familiar, but this time there was an urgency to it that raised the hair on the back of Hank's neck. The creature stood and moved toward the cave entrance, then looked back at him expectantly. "You want me to follow you," Hank realized. "This toy, it's not just a gift, it's a message." The grizzly's response was to take several steps away from the cave, then pause and look back again. The meaning was unmistakable. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." Hank's first instinct was to refuse. His chest had been tight all morning, his heart stuttering in rhythms that reminded him how fragile his grip on life had become. A trek through the mountain snow, following a bear to some unknown destination, was the kind of risk a sensible man his age wouldn't consider. But the toy horse sat warm in his palm, and something about its presence demanded action rather than caution. Whoever had owned this had been small, vulnerable, dependent on the adults in their life for protection and care. If that protection had failed, if some tragedy had befallen a child in these mountains, then the very least Hank could do was learn the truth. "All right," he said finally, struggling to his feet. "But we go slow. These old bones don't move like they used to." The bear's patience proved infinite. It led Hank through the forest at a pace that accommodated his labored breathing and frequent need to rest. They followed game trails that wound between massive pines, the snow crunching underfoot with the particular sound that meant more was coming. The sky had that heavy gray quality that Hank had learned to read like a newspaper storm building in the west, probably arriving by nightfall. As they climbed higher into the backcountry, Hank found himself thinking about the children he and Sarah had never had. They'd tried for years, had even discussed adoption during the early days of their marriage. But mountain life was hard enough for two healthy adults. Adding a child to the isolation and dangers of their chosen existence had seemed like an invitation to heartbreak. Now, following a grizzly bear through snow that was knee-deep in places, Hank wondered if they'd been right to deny themselves that particular joy. Sarah had possessed such a gift with wounded creatures. Perhaps she would have been just as gifted with a wounded child who needed the kind of healing that only unconditional love could provide. The bear stopped suddenly, its massive head swinging toward a cluster of boulders that formed a natural shelter among the trees. At first, Hank saw nothing unusual about the formation, but as his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he made out the remnants of human habitation, a few rotted timbers that might once have been roof beams, the blackened stones of a fire ring, the geometric lines that only human hands create. "Someone lived here," he said, approaching the ruins carefully. "Recent enough that there's still wood." The bear moved to a specific spot among the fallen timbers and began digging carefully with its massive claws. Not the frantic excavation of an animal seeking food, but the deliberate, respectful work of someone uncovering something precious. After a few minutes, it stepped back and looked at Hanky Expectantly. In the shallow depression the bear had created, something glinted in the filtered sunlight. Hank knelt stiffly and brushed away the remaining snow and debris, revealing a small metal object that made his chest tight with understanding. A collar, but not the weathered leather band the bear wore. This was smaller, made of cheap metal that had tarnished green with age. The kind of collar a poor family might have fashioned for a beloved pet, hammered out of scrap and polished with love rather than money. Attached to the collar was a small metal tag, and engraved on its surface in careful block letters was a single word: Tommy. Jesus, Hank breathed, sitting back on his heels. There was a child here, a boy named Tommy. The bear made a sound that was half whimper, half moan, and suddenly Hank understood why the creature had brought him here. This wasn't just the site of some long-ago tragedy. This was personal. The collar the bear wore, the way it had appeared at Hank's fire like a ghost seeking help, the gifts that felt more like offerings than simple animal behavior, it all pointed toward a connection that went deeper than coincidence. "You knew him," Hank said, looking up at his companion. "This boy, Tommy, you knew him, and something happened to him here." The Grizzly's confirmation was to approach the ruins and lie down. Among the fallen timbers, its massive head resting on its paws in a posture of mourning so human it took Hank's breath away. The creature's eyes remained fixed on the spot where the collar had been buried, and Hank realized he was witnessing grief that had been carried for years, maybe decades. "What happened here?" he asked softly. "What happened to Tommy, and why? Are you showing me this now?" But even as he asked the questions, part of him was beginning to understand the answers. The bear's unusual intelligence, its almost human responses to emotion and speech, the way it had appeared at exactly the moment when Hank was ready to give up on life. None of it was coincidence that the toy horse felt heavier in his hand as he stood, and Hank found himself looking at his companion with new eyes. Not just a bear, but something more complex, a creature carrying burdens that went beyond simple animal instinct. "You're not just grieving for Sarah," he said slowly. "You're grieving for Tommy too. And somehow, you think I can help with that grief." The bear lifted its massive head and met his gaze, and Hank saw in those dark eyes a depth of pain that matched his own. But underneath the sorrow was something else, hope, fragile as a candle flame, but unmistakably present as the first snowflakes began to fall. Hank carefully pocketed both the toy horse and Tommy's collar. Whatever had happened in this place, whatever tragedy had connected a boy and a bear in ways that transcended the natural order, it was now part of his story, too. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Hank Tolliver had a purpose that went beyond simply waiting to die. The storm that arrived that evening brought with it the kind of snow that erases the world, turning familiar landmarks into white mysteries and muffling sound until even breathing seemed loud. Hank and the bear had made it back to the cave just as the first serious flakes began to fall, but now they were effectively trapped until the weather cleared. Not that Hank minded the enforced isolation. His chest ached from the day's exertion, and his heart had been skipping beats with increasing frequency since their return from the ruins. More concerning was the way his vision had started to blur around the edges, a symptom he recognized from the medical pamphlets Dr. Patterson had given him years ago when Sarah was dying. The bear seemed to sense his distress. It had positioned itself closer to Hank's bedroll than usual, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from its massive frame. Every few minutes, those intelligent dark eyes would check on him, and Hank had the unsettling feeling that the creature was keeping vigil, not just companionship, but actual medical monitoring. "I'm dying," he told the bear as wind howled around the cave entrance. "Probably sooner than I thought when this all started. That worry you?" The grizzly's response was to move even closer until its bulk pressed gently against his side. The contact was oddly comforting, like having a living furnace that radiated not just heat, but something that felt remarkably like care. During the long hours while the storm raged outside, Hank found himself examining the artifacts the bear had led him to discover. Tommy's collar was heavier than it looked, the cheap metal made precious by the love that had gone into its creation. Someone had filed and polished every surface until it gleamed, had carefully punched holes for the rough stitching that held it together. Poor materials transformed by devotion into something beautiful. The toy horse bore similar evidence of care. Every surface had been sanded smooth, every detail carved with patience and skill. The traces of blue paint that remained suggested it had once been a vibrant color, the kind of bright toy that would delight a child's eyes. Someone had spent hours creating this gift, had invested time and love into making something special for a boy named Tommy. "Tell me about him," Hank said to the bear as he traced the worn grooves of the horse's mane. "Tell me about Tommy." What followed was the strangest conversation of Hank's life. The bear couldn't speak, of course, but it could communicate in ways that went beyond language. A movement of its massive head toward the cave entrance meant the boy had come from outside their mountain range. A soft whimper indicated tragedy, loss, something gone wrong. When Hank mentioned age, the bear's response to 8 years old was immediate and unmistakable recognition. Gradually, through patience and interpretation, a story began to emerge. Tommy had been small for his age, the kind of child who needed protection rather than providing it. He'd been lost or abandoned in the wilderness, and somehow found his way to the shelter among the rocks where the bear had led Hank that afternoon. The grizzly had found him there, cold and frightened and far from any help. "You took care of him," Hank realized. "A bear adopting a human child. That's impossible, but that's what happened, isn't it?" The bear's confirmation was to rest its massive head on Hank's lap, a gesture so trusting and gentle that it brought tears to his eyes. The weight was considerable, but not uncomfortable, like being pinned beneath a living boulder that somehow conveyed love rather than threat. As the storm continued its assault on the mountain, Hank found himself thinking about Sarah's journal entries from the months before her death. She'd written about feeling the presence of lost souls in the forest, spirits that seemed to be seeking something they couldn't find on their own. He'd assumed she was being metaphorical, her artistic nature finding poetry in the wilderness. But what if she'd been describing something literal? "You're not just a bear," he said quietly, his hand resting on the creature's massive head. "You're something more than that. Something that happened when Tommy died, when a boy and his protector couldn't let go of each other." The bear made no sound, but Hank felt the truth of his words in the sudden stillness that settled over his companion. This wasn't just an unusually intelligent animal. This was something that existed in the space between the natural and supernatural, between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. Hidden in the bottom of his storage box, Hank found something he'd forgotten he still possessed, a fragment of an old map, hand-drawn and faded with age. It had belonged to Sarah's grandfather, a prospector who'd worked these mountains in the early 1900s. The paper was yellow and brittle, marked with notations in spidery handwriting that indicated water sources, dangerous passages, and places of particular interest to someone seeking mineral wealth. But one marking caught Hank's attention with sudden urgency. In the area where they'd found the ruins, Sarah's grandfather had drawn a small cross and written beside it, "Boy's Grave, 1952. God rest his soul." 1952, Hank whispered, calculating quickly. 70 years ago. Tommy's been gone for 70 years. The bear lifted its head from his lap and looked directly into his eyes, and Hank saw in that gaze a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. This creature had been carrying grief for 7 decades, had been bound to this mountain by ties that death couldn't sever. "You've been guarding his grave all this time," Hank said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "That's why you never left the area, why you seem so intelligent, so connected to human emotion. You're not just a bear. You're a guardian, a protector who couldn't accept that his duty was finished." The storm began to abate as dawn approached, the winds howling subsiding to a whisper that carried hints of clearing skies. But Hank barely noticed the weather change. His attention was fixed on his companion, on the growing certainty that their meeting had been orchestrated by forces beyond coincidence. "Sarah knew," he said suddenly. "That's why she drew you, why she kept your meeting secret. She understood what you were, even if she never said it out loud. And now you've come to me, because you think I can help you with something you can't do alone." The bear's response was to stand and move toward the cave entrance, where the first pale light of morning was beginning to filter through the settling snow. But before leaving, It turned back to look at Hank with an expression that was unmistakably a question. Will you help me? Hank looked at the map fragment in his hands, at the small cross marking a child's grave that had been tended by an impossible guardian for 70 years. His heart was failing, his strength was nearly gone, and any sensible man would have said his usefulness was finished. But Tommy's collar felt warm in his pocket, and Sarah's ring pulsed against his chest with each irregular heartbeat, and Hank. Tolliver realized that sometimes the most important work of a person's life comes at the very end, when there's nothing left to lose and everything to give. Yes, he said to the bear, to the mountain, to whatever force had brought them together. Whatever you need, whatever Tommy needs, yes. The journey to Tommy's grave took 2 days, not because of the distance, but because Hank's failing heart demanded frequent rest. The bear proved endlessly patient, adjusting its pace to match his labored steps and somehow finding sheltered spots for him to recover when his breathing became too ragged to continue. They followed the map fragment through terrain that seemed familiar yet strange, as if Hank was seeing it through different eyes. The bear led them along paths that didn't appear on any modern trail map, routes that seemed to have been worn by decades of solitary pilgrimage. Occasionally, Hank noticed small markers, a stack of stones here, a carved notch in a tree there, and realized the creature had been making this journey regularly for 70 years. On the second afternoon, they crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley that took Hank's breath away. Sheltered by towering peaks on 3 sides, the depression held a natural meadow where wildflowers bloomed despite the late season. A small stream wound through the grass, its water so clear he could see every pebble on the bottom. At the meadow's heart, beneath a single enormous pine, stood a small cairn of carefully stacked stones. There, Hank whispered, knowing without being told that they'd reached their destination. The bear made a sound that was part whimper, part relief, and began the careful descent into the valley. As they drew closer to the gravesite, Hank noticed details that spoke of decades of devoted care. The stones of the cairn had been arranged with mathematical precision, each one carefully selected and placed. Wildflowers had been planted in a perfect circle around the marker, varieties that bloomed at different times to ensure constant color throughout the growing season. Something had been tending this grave with the devotion of a loving parent. But as they reached the pine tree's shadow, Hank saw something that stopped him cold. Partially hidden beneath the lowest branches, so weathered it was almost invisible, lay a small skeleton. Human, child-sized, still wearing the rotted remnants of clothes that had once been blue. Jesus Christ, Hank breathed, sinking to his knees beside the pitiful remains. Tommy. The bear moved to lie beside the skeleton, its massive bulk somehow managing to seem protective rather than threatening. Up close, Hank could see that the bones had been carefully arranged, positioned with the kind of respect that spoke of someone who understood the dignity owed to the dead. A parent might have arranged a sleeping child just so, with hands folded peacefully and head resting on what had once been a small pack or pillow. But there was something else, something that made Hank's rational mind rebel even as his heart began to understand. Around the child's neck, green with age but still intact, hung a locket. And when Hank opened it with trembling fingers, he found 2 photographs that told a story more impossible than anything he'd imagined. The first photo showed a family mother, father, and a small boy with serious eyes and a gap-toothed smile. They stood before a cabin that looked remarkably like the ruins the bear had shown him, back when those timbers had been new and the roof had kept out the rain. The boy wore the same blue shirt whose remnants now clung to his small bones. Second photograph made Hank's world tilt on its axis. It showed the same boy, but older, maybe 10 or 11, standing beside a full-grown grizzly bear, not just near the bear, but with his arm draped across its neck in a gesture of absolute trust and affection. The bear wore a collar that Hank recognized as the one currently around his companion's neck. At the bottom of the photograph, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Me and Bear, best friends forever." "This is impossible," Hank whispered, looking from the photograph to the skeleton to the living bear that watched him with patient eyes. "A child can't survive alone in the wilderness for years. A grizzly can't adopt a human boy and keep him alive." But the evidence lay before him, impossible to deny. Tommy hadn't died immediately after being lost or abandoned. Somehow, he'd survived long enough to grow from the 8-year-old in the family photo to the older child pictured with the bear. He'd lived in that mountain shelter, protected and provided for by a creature that had defied every law of nature to become his guardian. "You saved him," Hank said to the bear, understanding flooding through him like sunrise. "When his family died or abandoned him, when he had no one else, you became his family. You kept him alive for years." The bear's response was a sound so mournful it seemed to come from the earth itself. The creature moved closer to the small skeleton, nuzzling the bones with a gentleness that spoke of memories too precious to abandon. But there was more to discover. Searching through the remains of Tommy's belongings, Hank found a small journal, wrapped in oilcloth. The leather cover had protected most of the pages from decay, and the boy's handwriting, growing more confident over time, told the story that the photographs had only hinted at. Day 47 since Mama and Papa got sick. Bear brought me fish again. I think he knows I can't catch them myself. Day 102. Bear let me sleep against him last night when it got real cold. He's warm like a big furry stove. Day 340, I made Bear. Collar out of the leather from Papa's old belt. He sat real still while I put it on. I think he likes it. Entry after entry, spanning what appeared to be several years, documenting an impossible relationship between a lost child and his unlikely protector. Tommy had learned to gather berries, to find edible roots, to prepare the fish and small game that the bear provided. He'd fashioned tools from salvaged materials, had repaired and maintained their shelter, had essentially become a feral child raised by one of nature's most dangerous predators. The final entries grew shorter, more labored, as if writing had become difficult. Don't feel good today. Bear won't leave my side. Bear brought me flowers, pretty yellow ones. Wish I could tell him thank you better. Getting hard to write. Bear knows something's wrong. He keeps bringing me things, trying to help. Love you, Bear. The journal ended there, but Hank could piece together what had happened next. Tommy had died illness, injury, or simply the accumulated toll of years in the wilderness, and his impossible guardian had arranged his remains with the care of a grieving parent. Then the bear had built the cairn, had planted the flowers, had begun a 70-year vigil that spoke of love deeper than species, stronger than death. "You've been alone all this time," Hank said softly, tears running freely down his weathered cheeks. "Guarding his body, tending his grave, carrying the grief of losing your boy." The bear lifted its massive head and looked directly into Hank's eyes, and what he saw there nearly stopped his heart. This wasn't just a bear anymore. Hadn't been just a bear since the day it had chosen to protect a lost child instead of walking away. Somehow, in ways that science couldn't explain and logic couldn't accept, the love between Tommy and his guardian had changed them both. The boy's spirit had become part of the bear, just as the bear's devotion had become part of the boy. "You're both here," Hank whispered, understanding finally dawning. Tommy's spirit and the bear's love all mixed up together into something new. Something that couldn't let go, couldn't move on, couldn't accept that the story was finished. Thus, the creature's confirmation was to place one enormous paw on Hank's hand, the touch gentle as a child's kiss. In that contact, Hank felt not just the bear's grief, but Tommy's confusion, a child's spirit that didn't understand why he couldn't wake up, couldn't play anymore, couldn't thank his protector for all the years of devotion. "He's trapped," Hank said, the full magnitude of the situation crashing over him like a mountain avalanche. "Tommy's spirit is trapped here, bound to the bear that loved him too much to let him go. And you've both been stuck in this limbo for 70 years, unable to live and unable to die." The bear made a sound that was unmistakably agreement, and Hank realized that his own death had been forestalled for a reason that had nothing to do with medical miracles or stubborn will. He'd been kept alive to witness this, to understand it, and somehow to help two lost souls find the peace that had eluded them for 7 decades. Sarah's ring pulsed against his chest with each irregular heartbeat, and Hank could almost hear her voice in the mountain wind. Some souls can't rest until they've helped another find their way home. That night, camped beside Tommy's grave under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, Hank did something he hadn't done since Sarah's funeral. He prayed, not the formal prayers of his childhood, recited by rote in the wooden pews of his family's Chicago church, but the raw, honest conversation of a man who'd found himself face to face with mystery that demanded faith rather than understanding. He spoke to whatever force had orchestrated this impossible meeting, had kept his failing heart beating long enough to discover 2 souls who'd been waiting 70 years for help. The bear lay beside Tommy's small skeleton, its massive bulk somehow managing to seem tender rather than threatening. Every few minutes, the creature would gently nuzzle the bones, a gesture so human in its grief that Hank had to look away. The love between boy and guardian had transcended death itself, creating a bond that trapped them both in an endless cycle of devotion and loss. From his pack, Hank withdrew the one book he'd brought on this journey, Sarah's worn copy of the Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. The leather binding was soft with age, the pages marked with pressed flowers and underlined passages that spoke of comfort, hope, and the promise of reunion beyond the grave. Sarah had turned to this book during her final months, finding in its pages something that medical science couldn't provide. "She used to read to me from this," Hank told the bear, opening the Bible to one of Sarah's favorite passages. Said it helped her understand that love doesn't end when breathing stops, that some connections are stronger than death itself. He read aloud by the light of his small campfire, his voice carrying across the hidden valley like a prayer made audible. Psalms about green pastures and still waters, verses about the valley of the shadow of death and the fear that need not accompany it. As he read, the bear's attention never wavered, those intelligent eyes fixed on his face as if every word carried weight beyond its simple meaning. "Listen to this one," Hank said, finding a passage that Sarah had marked with particular care. It says, "For everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted." The bear made a soft sound that might have been agreement or might have been sorrow. It was becoming harder to tell the difference. "She believed that," Hank continued, closing the book but keeping his finger marking the place. "Believed there was a proper time for everything, including letting go. Said the hardest part about loving someone was knowing when to hold on and when to set them free." As if summoned by his words, a change began to occur in the air around them. The temperature didn't drop, but something shifted. The quality of light, perhaps, or the way sound carried in the thin mountain air. Hank felt the hair on his arms rise, not with fear, but with the recognition that they were no longer alone in any simple sense. The bear's behavior changed too. It lifted its massive head and looked not at Hank or the fire, but at something just beyond the edge of visibility. Its ears swiveled forward with the focused attention of a creature hearing sounds that human senses couldn't detect. When it made a sound, low rumbling, almost conversational, Hank had the unsettling feeling that it was responding to someone. "Tommy?" Hank whispered, looking around the campsite without seeing anything unusual. "Are you here, son?" The answer came not as words, but as a sudden warmth that seemed to emanate from the small skeleton beside the fire. Not the heat of flame or fever, but the gentle warmth of a child climbing into a parent's lap for comfort. The sensation lasted. Only moments, but it left Hank with the absolute certainty that they were being watched, listened to, perhaps even evaluated by a presence that existed in the spaces between the visible and invisible worlds. "I think he's been trying to tell you something," Hank said to the bear. "All these years, Tommy's been trying to explain that it's okay to let go. That holding on to him isn't protecting him, it's trapping him." The bear's response was immediate and heartbreaking. It moved closer to the skeleton, curling its massive body around the small bones in a gesture of such desperate protection that Hank felt tears burning his eyes. This creature had spent 7 decades as a guardian, and the thought of abandoning its duty, even to grant peace to the soul it loved, went against every instinct it possessed. "I know," Hank said softly. "I know what it feels like to want to hold on forever. When Sarah was dying, I would have made any bargain, paid any price to keep her with me just one more day. But she helped me understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go." He opened the Bible again, finding another passage that Sarah had marked. This one was from Ecclesiastes, verses about love being stronger than death, but also about the proper time for all things too. Reached their conclusion. "She made me promise," Hank continued, his voice thick with memory, "that I wouldn't try to follow her right away. Said I still had work to do in this world, even if I couldn't see what it was yet. Took me 8 years to understand what she meant." The bear looked at him with eyes that held decades of accumulated sorrow, and Hank realized that his own journey to this moment had been as orchestrated as the creature's vigil. Sarah's death, his retreat to the mountains, the slow deterioration of his health, all of it had been preparation for this night. This conversation, this opportunity to help 2 lost souls find their way home. "You've been the best friend the boy could have," Hank said, addressing both the bear and whatever remained of Tommy in the warm air around them. 70 years of devotion, 70 years of love that never wavered. But love isn't about holding on forever. It's about wanting what's best for the person you care about, even when that means saying goodbye. The warmth around the skeleton intensified, and for just a moment, Hank could have sworn he saw a shimmer in the air, the suggestion of a small figure, translucent as morning mist, but unmistakably the shape of a child. The vision lasted only seconds, but it was long enough for him to see Tommy as he'd been in life. Serious eyes full of trust, gap-toothed smile that spoke of joy despite hardship, and most importantly, small arms wrapped around the neck of a bear that had chosen love over instinct. "He wants you to know," Hank whispered, understanding flooding through him like revelation, "that it's okay to let him go. That he's not afraid anymore, not lost anymore. He's been waiting all this time for you to understand that your job is finished. You saved him, you loved him, you gave him years of happiness that he never could have had alone. But now he needs you to do the hardest thing a parent can do. He needs you to set him free." The bear made a sound that was part whimper, part howl, part human sob. It was the sound of a heart breaking and healing at the same time. The sound of love finally understanding that sometimes the greatest gift it can give is release. Around them, the mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. The wind stilled, the fire's crackling softened to whispers, and even the distant call of night birds faded to silence. In that profound quiet, Hank felt the weight of 70 years of accumulated grief pressing down like a physical force. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice barely audible in the sacred stillness. "Tomorrow we help him cross over. We say the goodbye that should have been said 70 years ago, and we trust that love strong enough to transcend death is also strong enough to transcend separation." The bear's only response was to rest its massive head beside Tommy's skull. And in that gesture, Hank saw not just a guardian's vigil, but a parent's final benediction. By tomorrow's sunset, one way or another, their long watch would be over. Sarah's Bible felt warm in his hands, and her ring pulsed against his chest with each irregular heartbeat. Whatever strength remained in his failing body, whatever purpose, had kept him alive through years of waiting to die. It had all been leading to this moment. Tomorrow, he would help facilitate the most important goodbye of his life, not his own departure from the world, but a child's journey home. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Hank Tolliver prepared to perform the last and most meaningful task of his 73 years on Earth. Dawn came to the hidden valley like a benediction, painting the peaks rose and gold while mist rose from the small stream in ghostly spirals. Hank woke to find the bear exactly where he'd left it the night before, curled protectively around Tommy's skeleton, massive head resting beside the small skull with infinite gentleness. But something had changed during the night. The air itself felt different, charged with the kind of expectancy that comes before significant weather or momentous events. The quality of light seemed softer, more forgiving, as if the harsh realities of the physical world were beginning to give way to something more merciful. Hank's hands shook as he kindled the fire, not from his usual morning arthritis, but from the magnitude of what lay ahead. In his coat pocket, he carried the tools for this final task: Sarah's Bible, Tommy's collar, the toy horse that had started this impossible journey. Simple objects that had somehow become instruments of grace, keys to unlocking a door that had been sealed for 70 years. "It's time," he said to the bear, his voice carrying across the meadow with surprising strength. The grizzly lifted its head slowly, and Hank saw in those dark eyes the same mixture of determination and terror that he'd seen in Sarah's face during her final days. The creature knew what was coming, understood that this morning would mark the end of the longest vigil in the history of devotion. But knowing didn't make the prospect any less terrifying. From among his supplies, Hank withdrew something he'd crafted during the sleepless hours before dawn, a simple cross made from 2 branches of mountain pine, bound together with strips of leather cut from his own belt. The wood was rough, unmarked by any tool save his pocket knife, but it had been made with the same love that had once shaped Tommy's toy horse. "Every soul deserves to be honored," he said, working the cross into the soft earth at the head of Tommy's grave. "Every life deserves to be remembered and blessed, no matter how it ended." The bear watched his movements with the intensity of a congregation following a minister's hands during communion. When Hank opened Sarah's Bible and began searching for the right passage, the creature moved closer, close enough that its warm breath stirred the pages. "Here," Hank said, finding the verses that Sarah had marked with a pressed violet from their mountain garden. "From the Gospel of John, let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." As he read, the warmth that had touched them the previous night returned, stronger now and more focused. It seemed to emanate not just from Tommy's remains, but from the very air around them, as if the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond was growing thin as morning mist. "And if I go and prepare a place for you," Hank continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I will come again and receive you unto myself. That where I am, there the may be also." The bear made a sound that was part recognition, part surrender. It stood slowly, its enormous frame casting a shadow over the small grave. And for the first time since Hank had known it, the creature began to remove its collar. The action was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if it understood that some symbols must be abandoned before new understanding can take their place. But as the leather band came free, something extraordinary began to happen. The bear's form started to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. And through that shimmer, Hank caught glimpses of something impossible: 2 figures instead of one. overlapping like double-exposed photographs. The bear was still there, solid and real, but sharing the same space was the translucent figure of a child. Tawny as he'd been in life's serious eyes, gap-toothed smile, wearing the blue shirt that now lay in tatters around his bones. The boy's spirit had been there all along, Hank realized, not separate from the bear, but somehow merged with it. Two souls bound together by love strong enough to defy death itself. "Tommy," Hank whispered, seeing the child clearly for the first time. "You're really here." The boy's spirit nodded, and when he spoke, his voice came not as sound, but as words that formed directly in Hank's mind. "I've been trying to tell Bear it's okay to let me go, but he loves me too much to listen." The bear, now clearly visible as both creature and guardian spirit, made a sound of such profound grief that it seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. 70 years of protection, 70 years of devotion. And now it was being asked to perform the one act that went against every instinct it possessed. "Love means wanting what's best for someone," Hank said gently, addressing both parts of the impossible being before him, "even when what's best means saying goodbye." The wooden cross at the head of the grave began to glow with soft, warm light, not the harsh glare of electricity, but the gentle radiance of candle flame or starshine. And in that light, other figures began to appear, translucent as Tommy Budd, unmistakably present. A woman with kind eyes and graying hair, reaching out her hand with a smile that spoke of eternal patience. "Sarah," Hank breathed, his heart stopping for a moment before resuming its irregular rhythm. She nodded to him across the space between worlds, then turned her attention to the boy whose spirit stood trembling between earth and sky, caught between his guardian's love and his own need for rest. The light that emanated from the wooden cross grew brighter, not harsh but encompassing, like standing inside the heart of a star. Within that radiance, more figures began to materialize, translucent shapes that Hank recognized from the photograph in Tommy's locket. A man and woman, both young, both reaching toward the boy with expressions of infinite longing and joy. Tommy's parents come to collect the child they'd lost 70 years ago to sickness and mountain hardship. The woman wore a dress that might once have been the same blue as Tommy's shirt, and the man's eyes held the same serious depth that had marked his son's face. "Mama? Papa?" Tommy's spirit voice carried wonder and disbelief in equal measure. His mother stepped forward, her translucent hand extended in invitation. "We've been waiting, sweetheart. We've been waiting so long to take you home." But Tommy didn't move toward his parents. Instead, he turned to the bear that had been his protector, his family, his entire world for the years after his biological family had died. The creature's massive form was now clearly visible as both animal and spirit, the love between them having created something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "I can't leave Bear," Tommy said, his child's voice carrying the weight of absolute loyalty. "He saved me. He took care of me. He's been alone all this time because of me." The bear made a sound that was part whimper, part roar, and Hank understood that this was the heart of their trapped existence. Tommy couldn't move on because he wouldn't abandon his guardian, and the bear couldn't release Tommy because its love was too protective, too fierce to accept that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. Sarah stepped closer to the bear, her presence bringing with it the scent of wildflowers and mountain pine. When she spoke, her voice carried the same gentle authority that Hank remembered from their years together, the tone she'd used when coaxing injured animals to accept help. "Love doesn't end when we say goodbye," she told the great creature, her translucent hand reaching toward its massive head. "Love transforms. It becomes something that connects us across any distance, any separation. Tommy will carry your love with him wherever he goes, and you'll carry his gratitude. But he needs to go now. He needs to rest." The bear's anguish was palpable, a grief so profound it seemed to make the very air tremble. But slowly, with the painful deliberation of someone making an impossible choice, the creature began to change. The overlap between bear and spirit began to separate, revealing what Hank now understood had always been there. Two distinct beings whose love had bound them together beyond the natural order. The bear was indeed a bear, massive and wild and magnificent. But the guardian spirit was something else entirely. The essence of protection itself. Love made manifest. Devotion given form. For 70 years, they had existed as one entity. But now they were gently, painfully, lovingly coming apart. "You have to let him go," Hank said to the guardian spirit, his voice thick with emotion. "You've protected him for 70 years. You've loved him beyond death itself. But now he needs you to do the hardest thing a parent can do. You need to trust that he'll be safe without you." The guardian spirit looked at Tommy with eyes that held 7 decades of accumulated tenderness, then slowly, deliberately, began to fade. As it did, the bear, the actual bear that had chosen love over instinct so many years ago, stepped back, releasing its grip on the impossible bond that had defined its existence. "Thank you," Tommy whispered, and this time his voice carried sound as well as meaning. "Thank you for everything, Bear. Thank you for saving me, for loving me, for never giving up. I'll never forget you." The boy turned toward his parents, who waited with expressions of joy so profound it made Hank's chest tight with sympathetic emotion. But before he took that final step, Tommy looked back at Hank with gratitude that seemed to encompass all the loneliness, all the waiting, all the love that had brought them to this moment. "Tell him he can rest now," Tommy said. "Tell him his job is finished." And then, in a burst of light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, Tommy ran toward his parents. They caught him in embraces that transcended physical form, holding him close as the three figures began to rise, becoming lighter, more translucent, until they were indistinguishable from the golden morning light itself. The last thing Hank saw was Tommy's gap-toothed smile, radiant with joy and peace, before the family disappeared entirely, leaving only the scent of wildflowers and the echo of a child's laughter carried on the mountain wind. The bear, just a bear now, but somehow complete in its simple animal nature, looked around the meadow as if seeing it for the first time in 70 years. The weight of impossible responsibility had lifted from its shoulders, and what remained was a creature that had loved deeply, served faithfully, and could finally rest in the knowledge that its duty was done. The wooden cross no longer glowed, but it remained standing at the head of Tommy's grave, marking not just where a child had died, but where love had proven stronger than death, where devotion had transcended the natural order, and where 3 lost souls had finally found their way home. Hank sank to his knees in the meadow grass, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that spoke of conclusions approaching. But for the first time in 8 years, that approaching end felt like completion rather than defeat. The journey back to Eagle's Peak took 3 days, not because of distance, but because neither Hank nor the bear seemed in any hurry to leave the sacred space where they'd witnessed the impossible. They moved slowly through the mountain landscape, 2 old souls who had shared something that words could never adequately describe. The bear was different now, still massive, still powerful, but somehow lighter. The weight of 70 years of supernatural responsibility had lifted from its shoulders, leaving behind a creature that moved with the natural grace of something that belonged entirely to the wilderness. It still accompanied Hank, but as a companion, rather than a guardian, walking beside him rather than leading or following. On the second night, camped beneath stars that seemed brighter than they had in years, Hank found himself speaking to the bear as he might have talked to an old friend after a funeral, quiet words about loss and relief, about the strange peace that comes when a long vigil finally ends. "You did good," he said, watching the creature settle beside their small fire. 70 years of love, 70 years of protection. That boy couldn't have asked for a better friend. The bear's response was a gentle rumble, content rather than mournful. For the first time since Hank had known it, the creature seemed at peace with itself, comfortable in its own skin, rather than carrying the weight of impossible duties. From the branch where Tommy had crossed over, Hank had cut himself a walking stick, not because he needed it for the journey, though his legs were unsteady and his heart continued its irregular rhythm, but because he wanted to carry something of that place with him. The wood was smooth mountain pine, naturally shaped by wind and weather into something that fit perfectly in his weathered hand. Each evening, he carved small details into the stick's surface, not artistic flourishes, but simple marks that would help him remember. A small cross to mark Tommy's resting place, a bear's paw print to honor his companion's devotion. Sarah's initials intertwined with his own, because some love stories deserve to be recorded in wood and memory. By the time they reached the familiar granite face of Eagle's Peak, Hank's walking stick had become a record of their journey, a testament, carved in living wood, to the truth that love can transform impossible situations into sacred ones. But standing at the entrance to his cave, looking out over the vista that had been his world for 30 years, Hank realized that something fundamental had changed. The cave no longer felt like a tomb he'd chosen for himself, no longer seemed like the proper place for a man to wait for death. It felt like what it had always been, a temporary shelter, a way station on a longer journey that wasn't finished. Yet inside, Sarah's photograph still sat on its shelf. But when Hank looked at it now, he saw not the memorial to a love that had ended, but evidence of a love that continued. Her smile seemed to approve of what he'd accomplished, seemed to say that his work in the world wasn't quite finished. He spent 2 days organizing his belongings, not with the methodical preparation of a man expecting to die, but with the practical efficiency of someone preparing to travel. Clothes that could be donated to folks in the valley who needed them more than he did. Tools that could find new purpose in younger hands. Books that deserved to be read by eyes that might see different. Truths in their familiar words. The only things he packed for himself were essentials. Sarah's ring, which would travel with him wherever he went. Her Bible, which had proven its worth as a guide to impossible situations. The walking stick that carried the memory of Tommy's crossing. And one photograph, not the formal portrait of Sarah that had sat on his shelf, but a candid shot of both, of them together, laughing at some long-forgotten joke, their faces bright with the kind of happiness that comes from building a life with someone who understands your heart. On the third morning, he wrote letters, not the final messages of a man expecting to die, but the reconnecting words of someone who'd remembered that isolation, however peaceful, wasn't the only way to honor the dead to his nephew in Sacramento, whom he hadn't spoken to in 15 years. I've been thinking it's time I came down from the mountain for a while. Do you suppose you could use some help with that hardware store you wrote me about? To the pastor of the church in Cedar Falls, where he and Sarah had been married. I've got a story to tell about love and faith and the kinds of miracles that happen when we're brave enough to help each other. Might be worth sharing with folks who are carrying grief they think is too heavy to bear. To Dr. Patterson's replacement at the Valley Clinic. I know my heart's not going to last forever, but I think I've got some good time left in me. Time that might be better spent around people than up here alone with my memories. The bear watched his preparations with patient understanding, as if it too realized that their time together was drawing to a natural close. On the final morning, as Hank shouldered his pack and took a last look around the cave that had been his sanctuary, the creature approached and gently pressed its massive head against his chest, not in desperation or need, but in the kind of goodbye that acknowledges a job well done. You take care of yourself, Hank told it, scratching behind the ears that had heard 70 years of a child's secrets. Find yourself a nice den for the winter, maybe a mate come spring. You've earned some ordinary happiness. The bear's response, was to walk with him as far as the tree line, then stop and watch as Hank made his way down the mountain path toward whatever remained of his life. When he turned for one final look, the creature was silhouetted against the morning sky. No longer a supernatural guardian, but simply a magnificent wild animal that had once performed the most extraordinary act of love in the history of the mountains. Hank's walking stick felt solid in his hand as he descended toward the valley, toward people and conversation and the possibility that an old man's story might bring comfort to other souls who thought they were beyond help. His heart still skipped beats, his legs still trembled with age and exertion, but he was no longer walking toward death. He was walking toward whatever came next, carrying with him the knowledge that love, real love, the kind that transforms and transcends and sometimes works miracles, never really ends. It just finds new ways to serve, new hearts to heal, new stories to begin dot behind him. The mountain held its peace, and somewhere in the high meadows, a small wooden cross marked the place where 3 lost souls had finally found their way home.